Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are definitively dispelling a really dangerous shop floor myth, the idea that cast steel and cast iron behave identically under a welding arc. I mean, if you've ever stepped into a shop and assumed two materials act the same just because they both happen to share the word cast, well, you're definitely not alone. It happens all the time. But treating them the same? That is a fast track to failed joints, ruined parts, and catastrophic cracking. So we're going to arm you with the hard metallurgical facts so you know exactly what you're dealing with the next time you strike an arc. All right, let's run through our agenda for today. First, we'll tackle the cast misconception. Then we'll dive into microstructure, looking at carbon and graphite. After that, we'll cover managing heat and cracking, selecting the right filler, and finally, we'll wrap up with cast iron types explained. Section 1, the cast misconception. Two entirely different animals. So we're starting right out of the gate with the most fundamental error people make. In reality, the word cast literally only describes how the metal was shaped in a foundry. It tells you absolutely nothing about its chemical soul. Think of cast steel as a familiar, forgiving friend. It's basically standard steel that just happens to have been poured into a mold, which means it can still deform under stress. But cast iron is a stubborn antagonist. It is chemically hostile, it is brittle, and under heavy stress, it doesn't bend. It just snaps. Section 2. Microstructure, carbon and graphite. The root cause. To really grasp why these two act so differently, we have to look under the microscope. And honestly, it all comes down to carbon. Check out this low carbon percentage for cast steel, just 0.1 to 0.5%. That is exactly why it welds just like ordinary wrought steel. The carbon is sitting nicely in a solid solution, no big surprises, it's totally predictable under the torch. But then look at this massive jump for cast iron. Up to 4% carbon. That is huge, and it completely changes the metallurgical game. When you have carbon levels this high, the material behaves in an entirely different way as it cools down from a molten state. Because of that massive carbon content, cast iron produces something called free graphite. As the metal slowly cools in its mold, the carbon actually precipitates out as these little graphite flakes. You can think of these flakes as microscopic fault lines built right into the metal itself. They act as huge stress risers. And here's the absolute most crucial takeaway. This free graphite is the single biggest reason cast iron is so incredibly hostile to weld. It introduces severe brittleness and gives carbon a direct path right into your weld pool, which basically guarantees porosity. Which brings us to this pretty harsh reality about gray cast iron's low ductility. Basically, it completely lacks the ability to absorb welding-induced residual stress through plastic deformation. You see, if you put standard wrought steel under thermal stress, it yields, right? It stretches a little bit to accommodate that tension. Cast iron has almost zero ductility. The absolute second you push it past its limit, there's no stretching. It just fractures. Section 3, managing heat and cracking, thermal gradients and ductility. So, how does this chemistry translate to what you actually do on the shop floor? Well, if you're welding cast steel, you just follow standard wrought steel rules. You're fighting hydrogen-assisted cold cracking, using standard low hydrogen practices, stuff you already know. But cast iron cracking, entirely different beast. It's driven by that low ductility we just talked about, combined with uneven thermal gradients. Meaning, even if you lay down a perfectly sound weld, you can easily crack the surrounding iron if the temperature gap between your weld zone and the cold rest of the casting is too high. And here is a number you absolutely must commit to memory: 1450 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 790 degrees Celsius. You have to be incredibly careful around this temperature. If you hold cast iron here for extended periods, you are creating the exact metallurgical conditions that lead to severe, catastrophic cracking. It is a major danger zone. So preheat isn't just about hitting a magic number on a thermometer and calling it good. It is about actively managing the entire thermal stress profile across this super brittle casting. You'll want to preheat gray iron somewhere between 500 and 1200 degrees Fahrenheit just to reduce thermal shock. But your actual technique is just as crucial. You've got to use really small weld beats to keep heat input low. You should be mechanically peening the weld between passes to relieve that stress. Keep your arc time minimized, and always direct your arc into the weld pool, not directly into the base metal. You're trying to gently coax this metal together, not blast a hole through it. Section 4. Selecting the right filler. The role of nickel. Since we know cast iron is packed with those nasty free carbon flakes just waiting to ruin our day, we have to be super strategic about our consumables. This table is basically your battle plan. For cast steel,
Business as usual, grab your standard E7018 or ally-matched filler, and you're good. But cast iron, it absolutely demands specialized nickel fillers. You literally cannot use standard steel fillers here.
Why nickel? The reason is pretty profound, actually. Nickel and nickel iron weld deposits are incredibly ductile, and they naturally resist the brittleness that happens when carbon gets picked up from the base metal. If you were to try and use a mild steel electrode on cast iron, that weld pool would just soak up all the free graphite, harden into glass, and crack before you even had a chance to flip your hood up. Nickel stops that from happening. Now, within that nickel family, you generally have two main options. ENICI is basically pure nickel. It lays down a really soft, low-cracking deposit that is absolutely perfect if you need to machine the part afterwards. But then you have ENFECI, which adds about 45% iron into the mix. So your choice totally depends on the goal. Do you need it soft and machinable for a single pass? Go pure nickel. Do you need serious strength, multi-pass capability, and tolerance for high phosphorus? You've got to grab the nickel iron rod.
Section 5. Cast iron types explain. Not all iron is equal.
As we wrap up the metallurgy here, keep in mind that cast iron is a broad category. It's not just one single metal. We basically have four main types. Gray cast iron is the most common, full of those crack-sensitive graphite flakes. Then there's ductile or nodular iron, which forms the graphite into little spheres, making it way more forgiving. Malleable iron uses temper carbon and is also weldable. But look at the last one on this list, white cast iron. The carbon here exists as super hard cementite, not graphite. While the first three can be repaired if you're really careful, white cast iron is practically unweldable. For that, you're generally looking at mechanical replacement, not an arc repair. Okay, the final hurdle, post-weld practice. Look, the weld is not over just because the arc stopped. Unlike cast steel, which might just need a totally standard stress relief, cast iron demands a highly deliberate, protected, slow cool. If you just leave your finished piece exposed to ambient shop air, the uneven cooling will literally rip the casting apart hours after you finish. You have to immediately wrap it in insulating blankets or put it back into a controlled furnace. It needs to cool perfectly evenly so it doesn't just snap while you're driving home for the night. So it all boils down to truly knowing your material. Take these facts with you onto the shop floor. Correctly identify what you're working with, apply the right preheat, pick the correct nickel filler, and never, ever assume two totally distinct metals act the same just because they share the word cast. So here's a question to leave you with. The next time you prep a cast part for a repair, are you absolutely sure you know what's under the surface? Because knowing the difference is quite literally the difference between a permanent fix and a shattered piece of metal. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and stay sharp out there.